Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Magnus Norman, the Deputy Director of the Statecraft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Council, and thank you for all of you for taking the time to join us for this event on supply chain vulnerabilities in the software era. The energy sector has obviously become increasingly global and complex, and increasingly dependent on software components in the supply chain. And unintended flaws in software leave the energy sector, the global economy, and our national security exposed to accidents and adversaries that can undermine the functionality of our critical national infrastructure. These issues, of course, demand serious attention in the form of long-term strategy and foresight, and that's what we're here for today, to discuss and debate and look at from different perspectives. So the Statecraft Center here at the Atlantic Council and our Cyber Statecraft Initiative are aiming to develop sustainable, non-partisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world, and this is obviously supply chain vulnerabilities is part of that theme. However, as most of you already know here in the audience, the complexity of these security challenges in the energy sector really means that no organization can go it alone, and certainly our event can't go it alone either. So that's why we're excited and honored to be working with some excellent partners today to make this event happen. So first of all, we're proud to be working with Saab North America and ICS Village and the Council's Global Energy Center on this timely discussion on software and supply chain risks in the energy sector. So thanks to all of you for helping us out today and for being here today. So joining us today, we have Tom Van Norman, Director of Application Engineering at ICS Village, and he is joined by Bryson Board, who is the CEO of GRIM. ICS Village has generously provided the industrial control systems range, which simulates a downstream oil refinery, and we'll get to that just here in a minute. And they will perform a live hacking demonstration before we transition to our panel discussion and our audience Q&A. After the simulation, we have a great panel lined up for you all. First with Andy Bachman, who's the Senior Grid Strategist with the National and Homeland Security Director at the Idaho National Laboratory. Then Joyce Correll, Assistant Director of the Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Jesper Grönvall, who's the Director for Business Development and Civil Security Systems at Saab North America here in town. And Cynthia Korderman, who's a Distinguished Fellow of the Global Energy Center here at the Council. And moderating and hosting this discussion will be Bo Woods, who's a Cyber Safety and Innovation Fellow here at the Atlantic Council with the Cyber Statecraft Initiative. I really only have one more thing to say, and that's just a bit of a housekeeping note. For those watching online through webcast and engaging through social media, you're strongly encouraged to tweet at us at Cyber Statecraft using the hashtag ACCyber. And with that, let's get to the demonstration and simulation. Bryson and Tom, the floor is yours.
So we're the founders of the ICS Village, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. Bo is also a co-founder with us, and then our fourth co-founder is down in Australia, and that's Larry Van Andeweel. And I get extra credit whenever I say the very long Dutch name correctly the first time. So just bear with me if I mess it up again. And the reason we started this is that we really understood that this began as a project of passion. And I really like to always call out Tom here, because Tom really was the technical atlas that kept this going over all of these years. And it's only been very recently that we've reorganized as a nonprofit to make this a lot easier. Because you might have noticed, this is a pretty expensive exhibit. It's also really heavy. And as much passion as there is in the world, that doesn't provide the resources to be able to take this thing all over the place. Because one of the biggest things that we find as a challenge in computer security is it's really hard to understand these concepts when they're very abstract. Well, as you notice, this is an abstract. This is physical. So we find that there are really three kinds of demographics when we bring the nonprofit that we encounter. The first, and this is okay, I'm not going to ask anybody to raise their hands, but a lot of people don't even know what an industrial control system is. I've had it claimed to be all sorts of things when am my volume off? Okay. The feedback sounds strange. I don't even know what an industrial control system is. I've heard everything from that's the kind of thing that keeps your hand from getting cut in a table saw, to is that the table saw itself? So this is the general layman's perspective of what is industrial control systems. This is the average population. The second are information technology professionals who aren't aware of the differences of how industrial control systems differ from regular technology, or the impact of industrial control systems on their lives, because they're used to the servers or the desktops right in front of them, and forget the fact that how did the power get there, how did the water get there, and why do you have air conditioning? And then the third demographic that we engage are IT security professionals who need to get a chance to understand that this is an entree to different platforms so that they can start to hone their craft in a different direction, because the same kinds of security solutions that work in IT don't necessarily just work over cookie cutter to industrial control systems. And so what we have here, and you're going to have to use a little bit of imagination because this clear substance here is now oil. So maybe that's a clean oil reference. We can make an environmental joke. Normally, this would also be, we'd have additive in here, so you would actually be able to see the color change as we demonstrate the hack. Apologize, we forgot that. So what we have our setup here for the oil refinery is a heat exchanger, which would be heating up the oil for refinery into a tank that is right now kept at a constant control state through a variable speed device, which is how, and you can hear that hum in the background, that's how we're able to keep this at this constant temperature. And so if you can think about maintaining that as I control refining the process through additives, this would be our oil refinery station that then would go on to transmission. Unfortunately, in this setup, we have an engineering control workstation fronted with a human management interface, or HMI. HMI is what allows you, you changed my malware, is what allows you to actually physically touch to be able to control the industrial control systems so that we can change different elements of the plant. And so what's going to happen here is our engineering workstation is going to be attacked through a remote access ransomware that is then going to find its way into, through our human management interface, into our safety instrument. I was going to end up tripping over that. Safety instrumentation systems, which is going to kill our pump. Tom, you look like a bad guy.
I'm a bad guy. So
this is very similar to the Taint or Trisis malware that has been seen.
So what I just did, or what I would normally do, I apologize, but on the way down our computer broke, so I had to use my laptop in the back. Usually I'd sit out in the audience and we would remote in to the control system network, what I just did, except I have to be connected with a network cable today. On my computer, I gain access to the control system remotely, and on my computer I transfer a file that when I execute it, it sends commands to the PLC to shut off the pumps. Now, what's unique about that is I'm an authorized user, because what I do is I gain access to, say, a control engineer's house, for example. Control engineer is going to remote into the plant after hours, going to fix something. I'm the adversary. I'm watching it. I might have gained access through an IP camera, or somehow I gain access to his house. I see his computer come up online. He connects to the plant. I get a hold of his computer, and I transfer my malicious code. However, my malicious code is completely legitimate code. What I'm doing is I captured the network traffic. I put that into an executable. I transfer that. I execute it, and it shuts my pump off. Every step of the way, it's legitimate traffic. Transferring that file, running that file, the type of, this case here is Modbus packets that I put into an executable and ran it. So it is all legitimate traffic. However, it's all nefarious traffic.
It's important to understand, while this is a rather simplistic simulation, the access methods to get here are manifold. Unlike information technology, I might not just be coming in through a traditional IT interface. There can be either physical access or RF access to different mechanisms here. You could argue that it's very simple that an engineer who's watching would immediately see that happening and would attempt to respond. But in malware, it could potentially brick any of the control devices that are in fact doing that. And so when they go through their management interface to try to change something, they can press those buttons all day long and nothing might happen. Or the ability to control this HMI directly, and again, you can press the buttons and nothing would happen. So there are many points throughout the chain of events here that each one of those represent a particular vulnerability, and depending on how that is used in the campaign, could have those intended effects. Future state of where we're going with this is that we would like to turn the village into a full slice of modern life. We're hoping that in Las Vegas at DEF CON, we will have all the way from power generation to transmission to control here, going through in this case, it'll be a water treatment plant. And then at the same time, we'll also have an entire networked house all connected together. So you'll be able to see the upstream and downstream effects of different pieces. At the same time, we will have the ability to have participants come up, play through an attack platform. So you'll get to be the bad guy or girl. And then at the same time, you can play blue team on this range and be able to see all of those pieces going on both sides and actually being able to do it yourselves. That's all we got.
Thank you.
Oh, and you turned it off. Good.
Thanks for that, Tom and Bryson. So after that appetizer, I guess we're the main meal. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to see so many faces in the crowd and obviously everybody online, too. I think we've got a really cool panel for you today. It won't be quite as interactive as that, but we will have time at the end for interactivity, questions, Q&A. We're also on Twitter, so if you're not in the room, or even if you are, and you want to engage with us, hashtag ACCyber or @Cyber Statecraft. You can tweet at us. At the end, we'll pull some of the questions from Twitter and answer those live and in person on stage. I've got a very distinguished panel over here to my left, your right, and it starts with Ms. Cynthia Quarterman, Distinguished Fellow, Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. Then we've got Andy Bachman. He's the Senior Grid Strategist for National and Homeland Security Directorate at Idaho National Labs. Then we have Joyce Carell, Assistant Director, Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate at the National Counterintelligence and Security Center at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And then finally, we've got Mr. Jesper Grunwald, Director of Business Development, Civil Security Systems at Saab North America. And what we're going to do is go down the line, give everybody a couple of minutes to just say who they are, how they fit into this, and then we'll lob some hard questions at folks and see how they respond. So we'll start with Cynthia to my left. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. Before that, I have run two of the energy related administrations in the government, including what was formerly called the Minerals Management Service, which is the offshore oil and gas program, and the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. So my perspective here today is to offer that of an energy regulator who has been in control rooms on the Outer Continental Shelf, on oil pipelines, gas pipelines, mining industry, refineries, all across the country and, in fact, around the world, and have seen situations such as the one demonstrated today, not actually happening at the time, but the fallout of those situations, not so much from cyber, but from real-world incidents. So my perspective today is to give you feedback on what happens if something like this occurs. As an example of something that has happened, it wasn't a cyber incident, but to say if there is a problem in your control room, what could happen? There was an incident in California where there was an electrical problem with the control room at a gas company, which led to too much gas coming into the system, pressure problem, and the SCADA, the control system, did not see what was happening correctly. It resulted in a lot of gas going in very quickly where it should not have, and ended in an explosion which killed 8 people, destroyed 38 homes, and took out an entire neighborhood. So there are real effects to mistakes that happen related to these controls. I will tell you later about what I think about regulatory solutions to those sorts of problems, but I will pass it on to Andy.
Thanks, Cynthia. Hi, folks. Bo, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to tackle this super tough, super challenging problem and to see if we can make some progress on it today. My background is having gone in and out of government since starting in the Air Force, being in some startups, being in IBM, and then ultimately coming back into what's sort of like quasi-government in a national lab, part of the DOE complex. This may sound like I'm recruiting, and maybe I am. If I say it's really a wonderful place to work. The job of these 17 or so national labs is to solve the most challenging, most daunting, and most important problems facing the nation. Get to work with fantastic, brilliant people. We have unique resources, to put it mildly, we can take advantage of, and it's just a tremendous thing. As I said, the most challenging problems, one of those today, and it has been, I think Bo keeps citing 30 years, is supply chain and security, and narrowing it down even more to be helpful into software. This is certainly thorny, and I'll be interested to see if the panel feels like we're making real progress on this by the end of the day, and of course whether folks in the room and folks coming through online feel like some light was shown on a difficult problem that's helpful. That's it.
Good afternoon. I'm Joyce Corral. I work in the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, NCSC. As part of the intelligence community. So my role is working across the U.S. government, working with the private sector, working with the national labs, working with folks like people here at the Atlantic Council, looking at how collectively we can come together and understand supply chain from a threat perspective, from a vulnerability perspective, and a mitigation perspective. Today, just the timing of the production of this report is one example of this issue of supply chain being a source of challenge that needs to be managed is one that is of increasing concern. This is also a time when there's a lot of attention being paid by Congress to how the government responds to these types of threats. So we have the opportunity to bring together key recommendations from experts in the field, experts in industry, experts in academia, and have a receptive mindset among policymakers to work through some of these challenges in a way that is actually implementable. So in that context, I hope the panel can surface some of those questions that get us at the problem-solving space.
Right. Good afternoon. My name is Jesper Granvall. I work for Saab North America, based here in Washington, D.C. Work with business development for our software solutions, primarily targeting airport control centers, ports, critical infrastructure protection, really trying to solve those problems with stovepiped systems, bringing together situational awareness. And that is the value proposition, but there's always the sides that you need to consider when you're doing such development and bringing more command and control to your control rooms. I would like to say first that Saab as a company has for quite a while been working with the Atlantic Council. I think you've been a great partner, and we think that this report is further evidence of you being able to just bring together the best and the most smart people. I think this report is really great, so thank you to the authors as well, and thank you for being here. I think one logical question could perhaps be what is Saab's interest here, so let me wrestle with that one. And I wish I had a good one-liner to respond to that, but I'd like to frame it this way. Saab is a producer of really mission-critical systems and platforms. Fighter jet, submarines, command and control system for airports, as I said, digital air traffic control, towers, and software is really the core of a lot of those products. For us, these systems, they don't work in isolation, rarely. They are placed in an ecosystem. So for us, it's important that the whole ecosystem works. There are a lot of stakeholders in this ecosystems or different ecosystems. So for us, it's of interest to be a part of this discussion and help shepherd it forward. So look forward to the discussion.
Good, thanks. So a couple of folks talked about the paper that we released today. If you guys are in the room, you probably had a chance to grab one. If you're online, it is now live. You can go and read it. Most folks in the room and watching online probably have not had the chance to read it yet. So I'll give you just a quick synopsis. The target is specifically energy sector cyber supply chain, and how do we make the energy sector more resilient? I think some of the guiding principles that we went into the paper with, and it was co-authored by Andy and myself, is how can we take what seems like a very hard problem, almost intractable, too complex to address, and break it down into some logical silos that then if we can pick off those problem spaces one at a time or collectively, we'll be a lot farther along than when we started. So we want we want everybody to walk out of the room today thinking, wow, that's a hard problem, but it's not intractable, it's not unaddressable, and give some tools and equipment to do so. For the last 30 years, the energy sector and the cybersecurity domains of concern have been moving closer and closer together. Today we have fully integrated IT and information technology, operational technology systems, as demonstrated by the range over here. And where folks in the energy sector are masters of their domain and the cybersecurity community are masters of their domain, where those domains overlap, we think we can be safer sooner together. And so the paper specifically looked at energy sector cyber supply chain, and it breaks it down into a couple of major distinctions across the supply chain, which is the operational supply chain issues and then product-based supply chain issues. In other words, who's got access to your operational environment, your partners and other people, who's designing it, setting it up on the operational side versus things that are in the product. Things like counterfeit, which are imitation chips or software or things that are in your supply chain, into malicious taint or what may be intercepted or implanted devices, something typically of a nation state capability. And then a third type, which we're kind of naming and classifying for the first time as unintentional taint or unintended taint. And that is software and hardware that is designed and implemented as intended, but which has known vulnerabilities or known security issues with it that are just endemic in the system. And in order to address these challenges in different parts of the supply chain, we had four remedies, four general categories of things to do. That is, apply and expand existing frameworks across the energy sector. Things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, like the NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation's critical infrastructure protection principles, which could be applied to oil and gas, renewables, and other sectors. Things like the Department of Energy's cybersecurity capability and maturity model. Things that already exist, apply them more broadly and give them a little bit more weight. Second is to incentivize trusted practices that we already know work. Things like a secure software development lifecycle. Microsoft is one of the pioneers of that in the IT space, and being able to apply that, especially on the product side, will help remedy some of these issues. Looking especially at something we call a software bill of materials, which is basically an ingredients list for the products you buy, so knowing what's in them. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure, so when researchers or others find flaws in these systems, they can report them in good faith without fear of being sued or arrested, so that those can get fixed. And providing secure updates and protecting identity access control. Third is identify vulnerabilities throughout the entire sector, whether it comes from operational supply chain issues or product supply chain issues, have a way to identify those systemically so that there can be oversight at a sector-specific level, whether that's government or private sector. And then fourth, we broke down some other potential models to ensure reliability of the supply chain. And these, in some cases, are very uncomfortable, such as heavier government oversight and regulation of oil and gas and the electric sector. Some of these I don't really like the idea of, but when you find yourself facing uncomfortable challenges, sometimes uncomfortable solutions are worth addressing or are worth bringing up in order to find what you like or don't like about them. And so with that, I'll throw out to the panel, how big is this problem of cyber supply chain issues, and what are some examples that we've seen manifest across these sectors?
I just want to say, as somebody that started working on this paper and this concept a couple of years ago with Bo, we don't want to give you the wrong impression, like it's the only thing we did for 2 years when we came up with this. Like every day and night working on this one. How many pages is it? It's not that long.
No, it's not too long.
But one of the challenges we faced was trying to narrow it so that it wouldn't just be so high level and generic that just had some concepts but nothing that you could ever consider implementing. And getting in order to get more specific where you could be thinking it could be actionable, then we'd like get rid of 99% of all industries in the world, and it would only be such a limited market. So you could do a paper similar to this for a different sector. You could focus on something other than software. But I think this is a first stab at sort of what we hoped was a right size chunk of goodness. And even if you're not from the energy sector, and even if it's not just about software in your world, you can make inferences from what we captured here. I'll just say one more thing on this present piece. This is a super hard, almost impossible problem. It's probably cliche. It's a cliche to say that if it wasn't painful to do things differently, we would already be doing them differently because it's producing so many egregious challenges to us. But as Bo indicated, even in his statement of, I think it's the 4 or so paths towards some type of remedy, not a solution, just improvement, all of them will be, there'll be vocal opponents with good cases, good business cases for opposing all of them. Nevertheless, we think the time has come that the security merits and the security risks now are strong enough and strategic enough that they in some cases outweigh those extant business drivers.
Can I ask why you guys decided to do supply chain?
I don't know.
We will. I have one. Part of it is because it is hard.
That's an attitude thing, right? You only want to work on it if it's hard, otherwise.
Well, look, like you said, if it were easy, people would have solved it before. A lot of the easy things, a lot of the easy solutions have already been proposed and put into place in different aspects of cybersecurity in the energy sector. This is one where I think you have some really unique control points. You have the procurement control point, you have a regulatory control point, you have an insurability control point in some parts of the sector, and you have a board of directors industry-specific control point. So if you can map those control points and use those as a way to leverage supply chain to fix some of the systemic issues across the sector, then I think it's a really good place to apply some resources to think through some solutions.
And I have 2 parts to respond to you with, Cynthia. First is that one of the startups I was in, we made a software product that would scan software to find problems, known and unknown security problems, categories called static source code analysis. So you get to see both sides. You get to see the fact that as our tool got better, it found with greater fidelity egregious security flaws that were baked into products that people cared about, including a lot of custom stuff. So that was an eye-opener. And then I'm not a developer, but I got to see our developers making a thing out of software that was supposed to bring you security and better knowledge, and yet it was made out of software. And could it withstand this? Could you basically have the snake eat its tail? Could our product put itself through the security analysis and get a gold star on its forehead? That was questionable. We weren't always sure about that. The second part of the timing for being interested in supply chain was I joined the lab around 2014. I think one of the incidents that the paper cites is called HAVEX, and that's a sort of watering hole attack where users of certain products are told it's time to get a new version. Click here to go to the trusted site where you've done this in the past. It's your trusted vendor. And so, okay, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do, and I'll be updating and, in theory, patching potentially, and improving the security of my product. But this was an ingenious approach, which now has become somewhat common, and I guess less ingenious, that site itself was corrupted, and what they downloaded hurt them. And DOE at the time, when I just joined it, was like, we need to solve this problem, or at least make progress on it. And so that was one of the first things. I think when that got into me, and I knew Bo, that's around that time, that would be 8 years ago. I mean, sorry, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I think it was 2 or 3.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about it for a while. And there were a number of energy sector, cyber supply chain things that were starting to pop up, like NERC 13 and like NIST working group, some other things. Joyce?
Yeah, to your question, I think the attention on this issue has been expanding over the last couple of years. So certainly, for the last decade, there's been a lot of information provided from threat information to mitigation recommendations, best practices. The energy sector developed the capability maturity model. So there are a number of things that have advanced the state of the practice in the energy sector, but there's increasing attention from across multiple sectors to look at better managing supply chain risk, or having, as you described, a threat introduced via an upstream point of entry. So we see the FERC taking an active interest. We see the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, taking an active interest. The financial services sector. All of these organizations relying upon certain critical infrastructure underpinning that. There's an increased interest in being able to understand the landscape and be able to begin thinking through what the solution space is. This is to your initial comment about the different entry points. When we actually think about supply chain risk, it's really about bringing together people from many different walks of life who actually have to come together and speak to one another. So it's the procurement folks, it's the technologists who are doing the research, or who are doing the development, or who are maintaining your systems, to your security personnel, your HR people who are looking at your onboarding, offboarding practices. So you really need to bring together a team of people to think through how you manage your risk and ensure that these people are communicating with one another with a common vocabulary, so people don't talk past each other. So like IT/OT, how do these two currently different disciplines come together and share information in a way that makes sense to both sides. Yeah. But it's an increasing issue that's drawing additional attention from trying to understand just how bad is it, and can we make a difference?
Yeah, so as the energy sector is transitioning from kind of what I would call special purpose machines, things like physical switches that flip on or off, and some of the other hyper specialized capabilities and technologies. If you think about like the old pictures from the 1970s of the board of blinky lights that somebody would have in an energy facility. Those are no longer electric relays. They're being replaced by general purpose computing machines, where the special purpose machines can do only one thing. It can't do something it's not intended, or almost can't do something it's not intended. General purpose computing, the magic of that is it can do everything. Anything you ask it to do, it can do for you. And there's a tension there, because we want things to be reliable, we want them to get to market quickly, we want to be fast, efficient, and standardizable. And software running on general purpose computing can give us that, but it comes in some cases at a cost of reliability and trustworthiness, that it will only ever do that one thing we want to. So what does the future hold? Are there technologies that can be put into place that can help ensure that that type of a tension gets resolved? Can we have special purpose computing machines in our procurement and in our products that are more resilient to attack? Or is that kind of a pipe dream and a fantasy?
Well, just to add on to what you were saying in this particular question, a decade ago, when I look at the oil and gas industry, the SCADA, the computing centers were pretty much offline. They were contained. Nobody could get into them. But with the advent of all this new technology, now people are entering at different points and the vulnerabilities are increasing. But I think it's important to remember, at least within the United States, the large range of companies that we have who are operating in this space. I mean, for example, oil and gas companies, pipeline companies, we're talking thousands. Some of them are mom and pop, some of them are huge. So we really need a solution that can be scalable for the different sizes of companies that we're talking about here.
It might be like with alcoholism and dependency. The first step is to admit you have a problem. I'm not sure if this is going to work out, but I'm starting with this approach. We have become so dependent on these systems. We've embraced them and deployed them because they're efficient, they bring new capabilities, we can automate things that humans have a hard time doing or doing without error. We can get rid of humans and save money by automating and using more software on flexible platforms so that we can reprogram to do even more amazing and great things. I'll cite one of my cybersecurity heroes here. He's been called the Henry David Thoreau of cybersecurity. His name's Daniel Gear. He's known as this both for his unique hairstyle and for his farming capability. He's also brilliant. He's the CSO of In-Q-Tel right now, but has a lot of MIT in his background too. I think you can summarize a lot of the desire to make progress on this topic with just one of his short phrases, which is the wellspring of risk is dependence. And we've made ourselves so dependent on these systems that are complex and hard to understand that we don't have a plan B except to add more software and hope that that does the job. But where does that software come from? How do we know it was created using secure development lifecycle practices? And all the other challenges that attend making ourselves completely dependent on these systems. I'll pause there just to like tee up the thing, and we'll see if we come back to some solutions for it.
Okay.
Just one perspective is, on the other side of that is, by adopting these types of systems, we're also pushing the limits for innovation. And what I like about your paper is that you also try and highlight, okay, these are some really difficult, thorny questions and challenges. Here are some ways of how we can address that, how we can try and work better together. Because if we don't adopt these systems, it's all competitive, both from a company perspective. We need to drive innovation, but we also need to make sure that our products deliver the value that we say they do. But it's also from a national perspective. It's a competitive world out there, and if we're not doing it, others will. And where does that place us? So I think it's really important to also keep focusing on, what could we do about it?
Yeah.
I think to your question about making a choice between a special purpose device or a more flexible general purpose device, people are going to want both. So what is your risk appetite? Is it the dependence? Is your insatiable? Or is it, do you know what your risk appetite is? And I think some people may perceive that they have an understanding of their risk appetite until they begin to dig into understanding what their third-party relationships are. If you don't have a software bill of materials, do you know what you're getting? If you do have that insight, does that change what your risk appetite is or not? So I think as we're going to see a shift in the risk landscape that will inform how people make decisions on single purpose, flexibility, or some combination.
Yeah, and one of the parts of our recommendations is to look at how you fall back to more, maybe more reliable, more manual processes. Do we have the technologies still in place? Are they still operational? Do we have the expertise to use them? Are the people who are there trained to use them? You just keep shaking your head.
I'm thinking of some FAA incidents that happened with the aircraft.
She's very negative.
Yeah, well, people trying to land planes and forgetting how to do it because they're so reliant upon the computers technology.
They become de-skilled.
Yes.
Yeah.
Safer sooner.
I was going to say it may have been discussed on this stage before, but and perhaps I oversimplify a little bit, but one of the principal lessons and hopefully relevant lessons from the Ukraine blackout cyber attack of December 2015. That's where there's videos you can see the operator chasing the cursor around because someone else is driving the cursor and opening breakers. Operator's trying to click and close them again as fast as the attacker is opening them. This was there were 3 utilities out of 4. 4 were targeted, 3 were breached, and were part of the blackout at the distribution grid level. One of the lessons is that they were halfway towards implementing distribution automation, which would have allowed them, once fully implemented, to let a lot of people go because they didn't need them anymore because the machine would take care of everything, the software would take everything. But because they weren't all the way there, when they lost trust, they had good reason to understand they lost trust. Not everybody else is so obvious. When they saw they couldn't trust the systems anymore, they were able to they had the humans on hand who still had the muscle memory and the institutional operational engineering knowledge to know how to run their systems and keep them going, albeit less efficiently than they were hoping, but still today, some of those systems in Ukraine are being operated in this more manual, less efficient, and yet more reliable, trustworthy mode until they can figure out a way to get them back up. That's one of another benefits of again, I'm not recruiting, but the national lab places, the folks who've gone over from the United States and other places to help the Ukrainians out are many of my friends and colleagues I work with every day.
So then, should the energy sector hiring pipeline go straight to Ukraine? They've got the people?
I don't know how long they'll have the people and enough people. Again, this is one of those debates where everybody can actually be right at the same time, even though they're arguing opposite things. There are excellent business reasons to go head over here into automation and IoT, and like one of the hot topics of the day, AI, right? AI is fantastic. It will solve all of our problems because humans make mistakes and they're slow and expensive. AI will never make mistakes. It will be fast and cheap once we have it deployed. That's great. It'll solve a lot of security problems. The only problem is that in the security world, tools all have dual purposes. And the other mantra is offense tends to evolve faster than defense. So if you put all your eggs in the AI basket, make sure we're talking about supply chain. Beware, because AI will be on the other side too. That will be our adversary and more powerful.
All right, so going to supply chain, last week there was a report that US government had a hard time getting rid of all of the Kaspersky software code across the government systems. And think about it, it's like, oh, well, it should be easy. You just go on all the computers and click uninstall for the antivirus software, right? Well, actually what the problem was is not that they couldn't uninstall it off of the desktops. It's that the code had migrated and had been injected into these other systems, by design, intentionally, because there's some high quality code that you could put into software routers to be able to do, to improve security of them. And so we tend to see at the software code or package or component level that some of these components can be in many, many different places you wouldn't expect. So now if you've got to go and try and hunt down where all of the components might live, you have a hard time doing it if you're not able to track that. Something similar is the case if you're looking to, for instance, find where Heartbleed might be in your systems. Heartbleed was a vulnerability from a few years ago that essentially allowed any attacker to pull random bits of memory. So they could pull passwords off of servers through a very, very simple technique. Now, as we get more and more complex systems, they fail more complexly, and they're made of more components. So chasing those down becomes harder and harder. If it's that difficult when there's a presidential directive to do this across the national infrastructure, what lessons or analogies can we draw in the energy sector for code migration or components showing up in places you don't expect them, and how can we address that?
Sounds like you're asking for a cure for cancer.
Well, if you've got one of those, we'll take it too.
No.
There's a number of authoritative published list of best practices for cyber security, sometimes referred to as cyber hygiene. I'll cite the one from the SANS Security Training Institute. Has 20 different things. If you do all of these things all the time perfectly, you'll be much more safe. You won't be completely secure, but you'll be more secure. The first one is asset management. Know what you have. Know what you have. Like, what have you bought that you've deployed that you use and you depend on hardware-wise? The second one is know what software is running on all those things. Make sure you know in exquisite detail the operating system, the version, the patch level, the DLLs, and other esoteric terms that most people can't process. You need to know these things because that's what the adversary knows when they spend time loitering on your systems and you don't see it. So you need to be fully aware of what you bought, what you've deployed, and what you've come to depend upon. If you had a software bill of materials, that would help you get a head start. But maybe the fact that most large industrial infrastructure companies, I could almost say all, but we'll just say most, they have no idea what they have. They fail on number one, which means they fail on number two, and the other 18 are much more challenging when you don't even, I think the saying goes, how can you secure what you don't even know you have? And in this case, we are not wandering off of supply chain issues. It seems like if you procured something, you'd be keeping track of it. You're spending money to maintain it and insure it and update and upgrade it, right? But somehow that, up at least until now, that hasn't been required from a business point of view, right? But from a security point of view, to the extent that companies begin to embrace the imperative to have a better understanding of their supply chain risks, I think you're going to see that being done more. It's going to be more common to see better inventories, better asset management in these companies, critical infrastructure companies especially.
Okay. We're going to go out for questions in the audience and on Twitter in just a minute. Again, hashtag ACCyber and at Cyber Statecraft if you want to ask something online. One more question before we do that, though. In the energy sector, there's an inherent drive towards safety and reliability. Now, part of safety and reliability can be a cybersecurity component, but it might be, in some cases, that cybersecurity is at odds with safety and reliability. If you lock people out of their system after 3 wrong password guesses, they can't get in to stop something that's failing, right? So when the consequences of some of these issues are life and death, when it's millions or billions of dollars, when it's national security issues, how can we balance all of those across the safety, reliability, and cybersecurity?
Well, I think it's an extremely difficult issue, and as a former regulator, I can tell you that everybody wants the regulators to fix things, and we often try to stay ahead of the new problem. We try to think about what is the new problem coming forward, but in fact, you end up spending most of your time dealing with the past bad thing that happened. And I can tell you, in preparation for this panel, I was thinking to myself that maybe I should have been thinking more about cybersecurity issues in my job as a safety regulator, because even though after September 11th, the the security issues associated with pipeline safety went over to Homeland Security, and we often said to folks who asked us about security issues, well, you know, that's over at TSA now, knowing that they only had 6 people essentially who could handle that issue. But we could have thought more internally about these issues when we talked about safety, because we did have integrity management programs for pipeline safety. And one of the things they have to do is evaluate the risks to their system. One of those risks could have been cybersecurity. I mean, it is a risk to safety. It's a huge risk to safety, but I don't think that ever got as far as it could. But that's not to say that regulation is necessarily the right answer here. I really think that collaboration is the number one piece of, the number one solution to this issue, because regulators don't have the money, the intelligence, the brains to stay on top of innovation, and things are changing, you know, with these viruses every second. So it really has to be the industry, the government, the software developers. Everybody has to be working together, collaborating, and sharing information. The government needs to be sort of the central source of that information to disseminate it out to folks, especially, say, smaller companies, in a way that is non-threatening to different energy communities. But standards, best practices, all that kind of thing is something that really requires a lot of collaboration among the different players, I think.
Like one of the challenges with regulation, other than I've heard many people in the industry say we don't want regulation. We don't think regulation will actually solve the problem.
I agree.
Regulation leads to a checklist, which leads to a compliance mindset.
Right.
And sometimes, while compliance is an important foundation for a good security regime, it's a compliance mindset sometimes leads to a complacency mindset. So how do you create sort of a state-of-the-art mindset that is goes from the compliance into the realm of practice?
Yeah.
I think that's the how do you build a practice of security? That is state-of-the-art.
Yeah. Well, let me respond to that, which is there are many ways to regulate, many ways to legislate in this space. One of the ones that I've heard some calls for are to specify where in the supply chain liability lies for some of these issues, or at least to carve it out and to understand it a little bit better, so that when something happens, you don't have people pointing fingers at each other, right? Oh, it was the operator's side, it was the supplier's side, it was whoever else, it was the individual who forgot to patch, in some cases. So there are non-checklist based methods to legislate or to regulate that might, one of the things we bring up in the paper is that we might need to evaluate that, right? Where in the supply chain is it best to place which liabilities and accountabilities and responsibilities? And I think we haven't really had that discussion, so we don't have a consensus agreement, and lack of clear understanding, it's always going to fall apart when something bad happens.
I think, and back to the linkage of security and safety and complacency, I think we're becoming less complacent as more and more mainstream folks, including folks on the Hill, to understand that the software that's was in their laptop or their cell phone, a breach of which or a problem which could cause embarrassment or financial loss or reputational loss or IP loss, I think those are the main categories, that similar software is now also in their car and in their medical device and in their myriad IoT devices in the airplane that they fly in. And it's sort of bringing it on home. I think IoT, Internet of Things, is a nice sort of communication, a way to understand for regular people that think of cyber as just an IT business side system, that it's things also. There's software in the things. And so a lot of those things are benign and aren't going to ever cause you a problem. Some of those things are large and hot and high pressure. And then we start to go into industrial control systems, which has been too exotic for most people to understand. IoT is a nice bridge technology to help bring these concepts to the mainstream. the more they realize that the security of these systems is part and parcel of the safety of the systems for their family, for their town, for their company. I think you'll start to see less of a complacency, and let's just do checklists, and let's really try to get this right. Even if it's tough, let's really try to get it right.
All right, now we're going to open it up for questions in the room and online. We'll pick some up. Who wants to go first, in the back or over here? Why don't we go start at the back? I always like people in the back row to get my facts, so that way you know they're paying attention. And then, yeah, we'll go to him next.
Hi, Melissa Hirsch. Quick question for the panel. So I think Andy touched on it a little bit, but how would you incentivize corporate structures or the C-suite to actually buy in to actually seeing cyber risk for industrial control systems and for the energy sector, or just critical infrastructure sector generally, as an enterprise risk? How do you equate this as something that will impact revenue loss, reputational loss, and obviously operational disruption? How do you get them on board so that they're not just, and it's not meant to be derogatory, but relegating the risk down the chain to the CISO or the chief risk officer? How do you get the CEO and the chief of procurement or the chief financial officer involved?
Sure, good question, Melissa. This was the idea, and keep constraining it to the electric sector is what allowed us to talk about the NERC SIPs. If we got too far away from electric sector, then we didn't really have too many analogs to that. NERC SIPs are sticks in the carrots and sticks approaches to motivation, human behavior. And there's an interesting part of the NERC SIPs. I think you spelled it out right when you introduced them, so. Yeah. Is that they have to have an executive sponsor. It can't just be the chief security person who actually is more of a manager or a director in most companies. There needs to be a senior level VP or higher person who owns the program and who ultimately signs off. So you do get the C-suite involved, the board of directors involved, and that was the stick. Do a good job, show you're compliant with these things, and do not be fined, and don't get embarrassed about it. I think many cybersecurity professionals hold out hope that insurance, there's others, but that insurance will be a carrot. And when you can demonstrably prove using something that we all accept, perhaps the C2M2 from DOE or other types of frameworks and maturity models, you can demonstrably prove that you're jumping through many of the hoops which are correlated with higher levels of security, and your insurance premiums go down because of it, then that might be a pump priming action, and you might want to keep doing that and do it more in the future.
Yeah, I'd say there's also a translation issue. If you talk about cybersecurity as ones and zeros, it's hard for executives and boards of directors to understand it. And we've got a real challenge with that. I don't think there's anybody out there right now who would say, yes, we have a great way to translate things that are cybersecurity issues into true business issues, except the kind of black swan breach events. Now, there's some ways to balance that, to do that. But one of the things we're hoping to do with this paper is to frame up some cybersecurity issues as supply chain issues that then can be treated with supply chain remedies that can be conceptually easy. Nice. So that executives can latch onto it and can get more engaged, involved, and apply the right treatments.
Siemens did a report in February of 2017, and I thought they had some interesting statistics that suggest that people are becoming more interested in it. They said 68% of executives thought that they had at least one cyber attack in the last 12 months. 61% thought that their ICS system was inadequate, and 69% said the organization was at risk because of third-party supply chain issues. So I think it is probably top of mind. I know if you talk to executives at the gas or the oil associations, it's one of the top 3 issues, top 5 issues for the organization dealing with cyber issues. So I think it's there.
For a long time, people that have been in this business for a while, not just strictly the supply chain aspects, but the cybersecurity in general, as we become more dependent, been trying to, I don't want to use any of the standard terms, wake people up, for example. We've been trying to educate people, let's say that, they don't understand the risk that they're taking on buying and deploying these systems and becoming dependent on them, right? And for a while, it was just a nuisance. It was nuisance level threat. So it was okay if you didn't take it all that seriously or organize accordingly. It's clearly, read the newspaper, read what's online. It's clearly a strategic level risk now, and company ending level events are happening. Certainly threats to national security too. So I think the man on the street, the woman on the street, the men and women on the Hill, I think they're sufficiently awake now. The problem is they don't know what to do with that energy and that attention. They don't know what the right answer is, and they're afraid that if they just like buy more products or spend more money, that doesn't seem to be doing the job. That's the definition of insanity, which I won't say, but it seems like if we keep doing status quo, we're going to keep having the same type of results while spending more money on it. I think the way Bo has captured it in the paper starts to put it into bite-sized conceptual chunks that business people can understand and might act on.
Yeah. We'll go one more in the audience and then go to Twitter. Oh, okay. Well, then we'll go to Twitter. So we got one. How can you increase software transparency while protecting copyrights and proprietary information? So I didn't.
Maybe it was a rhetorical question, and they already know the answer. And,
so I'll give part of mine, which is there are certain things you can disclose in the process of a client partner relationship. Like a software bill of materials for third-party software components, third-party and open source. It doesn't give up any intellectual property, but that enables and empowers the buyer to select higher quality systems, those with fewer known defects. It allows the buyer and operator to then respond more quickly. So when there's a new vulnerability, if you want to check your systems and see if you've got it, you can either run a penetration test on all of them, which is likely to make your energy sector stuff fall over, which would be bad for reliability, or you can do a 6-second SQL query, which would then tell you whether or not that known vulnerability is in your components. So there's that level of transparency, which doesn't give up intellectual property. And then there's also a slightly different role, which can be for oversight and for kind of sector-wide reliability, which is if someone like NKIC or ICS CERT, that it used to be called, or one of the industry groups can hold some of this information, then they can play that role of kind of watchdog to make sure that when there is something new that comes out, all the operators know about it as well as how to address it and take care of it.
Sure.
Yeah, I would think this is an opportunity for perhaps government or associations to really have a safe space for people to be able to put information in and not be afraid that it will be subject to trade secret release or that sort of thing.
It's certainly there are ways to create safe harbor. From the government perspective, there are ways to create safe harbor for information sharing. But I actually think sort of the question of companies doing business with one another, or government doing in a relationship with a particular vendor, or some of the second and third parties that vendor is working with, is I don't think enough people take advantage of really robust commercial due diligence. The quality of tools available to actually understand business relationships, coming from the financial sector for investing and advising investors. I'm talking about sort of the big accounting firms, KPMG, Deloitte. We have Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters. These companies all provide data aggregation, data analysis services that can be tailored to a user to really give you deep insight into a particular business from a third-party perspective. There are tools like scoring mechanisms that are being developed to understand third-party risk. And if more people availed themselves of these types of tools, and these types of tools were improved, the scoring models, you might be able to assess another entity, from a risk perspective, without having to actually ask them to disclose their intellectual property or put themselves at a competitive risk from a disclosure perspective. So I think there are ways to kind of neck that problem down, or the concerns.
I think I forget whether it was you, Bo, or Josh Corman, or somebody else who would compare the software bill of materials, or you can call it SBOM, it's more fun to say, that whether the SBOM is in some ways like a nutritional label on a box of cereal. And just start doing it, start using it. And the minute you start doing it, lawyers will enter the fray on both sides. Watch that happen, watch that fight happen, and the dust will eventually settle, and some middle ground will be chosen, and we'll start to develop the practices, and it'll get tuned over time. Certainly every time there was a new requirement to describe what was in that box of cereal, there were battles. That's going to happen with the software too. Yeah. But you'll get some exemplars. You'll get some company that differentiates itself by being more willing to be transparent up front. And all of a sudden, what seemed like crazy behavior to some starts to become the thing that they need to start doing too if they're going to keep up and be as trusted as their competitor is. So I'd just say, I think it's a great idea. I'm sure there's issues with it. I'm sure it'll be litigated. That's the country we live in. But let it play out, and then have that become a new norm.
Yeah, and this is not an unknown practice. It's not something that's never been thought of or tried before. It's increasingly, and we go into some of this detail in the paper, it's increasingly common to see this in the financial sector, in the healthcare sector, conversations, and there's even a couple of companies, oil operators, who are starting to do this, as well as talking with some congressional staffers. They're starting to look at the software supply chain transparency issue. I think Siemens led the Charter of Trust that was released in February at Munich Security Conference, which talked about supply chain transparency. So it may be a tension that gets battled over for a couple of minutes, but ultimately, I think looking forward in the future, we'll think it's as irresponsible to hide what's in our software and our ICS components as it was to hide what was in our Twinkies or something similar. Any other questions in the room?
Twinkies.
Yes, right up front here.
Do you know what's in your Twinkies?
Mike's coming to you.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. This may be the most stupid question of the day, but why isn't the name of this report Cyber Supply Chain Security in the Software Era?
So why is it not?
Why isn't that the name? Cyber Supply Chain Security in the Software Era. Am I wrong? That seems to be what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So why isn't that the name of the report?
I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe it was a smart question.
Well, you can talk to our marketing folks that may be looking for some part-time help in naming a report. I mean, I think there's many names that would describe the content of this report. We picked one that we thought was going to pop the best off the page. Yours is certainly good too. Another one in the back, I saw. Yeah.
Yes. Is the energy sector on a path to do what the communications sector started and then dropped? Some of the very impressive work the advisory group to the FCC did regarding the use of the NIST framework in 2015 and how to use the NIST framework to address supply chain risk and trying to move toward a path of trying to develop recommended risk-informed procurement requirements to help reduce risk?
It's a good question. I'm not sure, I'm not as familiar with the telecom industry's work in that area, but certainly the NIST cybersecurity framework is a great place to start plugging some of this stuff in, especially in some of their early stages of that framework where they're talking about how do you get the capabilities and components you need. I think there's any number of industry frameworks. NERC-CIP could be a good electric sector specifically.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if the way the question's framed is energy sector, might they do the same thing that it looks like comm sector did? And it doesn't seem so if you look at the artifacts they're producing. And so Bo's mentioning the NERC-CIPs, the mandatory security controls for the bulk electric system. Right now, the standard development process is haggling over, and FERC mandated that they develop guidance for supply chain. If you look at the new version of the cybersecurity capability maturity model, that's introducing, as that's being reworked, supply chains being injected in that. The new version of the NIST cybersecurity framework 1.1 has injected supply chain issues and controls into that. And DOE has mapped their C2M2 model to that framework. So everywhere you look, if you were concerned that that might happen, that ball might get dropped, it seems like it's so much front of mind for this sector that they may not know all the right, definitely don't know all the right answers, but are at least trying to keep the question in front of everybody long enough that some significant some progress is made.
Yeah, and if you are thinking along those lines, if you want to see that happen, then don't let current progress kind of be the end all and be all. Push it forward. I'd love to see more adoption of NIST cybersecurity framework across industry, across private sector, as well as getting better defined what the supply chain piece of that would look like, and rolling it out. Any other questions in the room? Yes.
Can you talk more about potential for...
Wait for the mic.
Sorry, can you talk more about potential for certification in the supply chain?
Yeah. There's, I'm failing to remember the ISO standards, but there's a handful of ISO standards looking at supply chain management. I'm not a supply chain expert per se. I came to this through a cybersecurity lens, but I know we've got some supply chain folks on the panel who maybe know a little bit more about certifications of supply chain in that aspect.
Sure. So certification is sort of an option. There are a number of things that people look at from a risk management perspective. Everybody wants the easy button. There is no easy button. So we talk about lists. Let's have a white list. These are the things that are allowed on my network as a classic cybersecurity best practice. Certification is another concept. So I think people have to think through for the sector. What benefits will be derived from a certification regime, and if a testing regime tests like existing functionality, what do you want to add to a certification regime to ensure that you have a comprehensive understanding of your risk? So certification can certainly improve from quality of product development or other processes, but it's not a be-all end-all.
Yeah. From a cybersecurity perspective, what are you going to certify against? Mm-hmm. So there's, they say the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. So everybody's going to have their different standards they'll certify against. And I will say a lot of the kind of cybersecurity standards and frameworks and certifications that exist today are more on the operations side rather than the design and product side. Mm-hmm. But there's been a little bit of work in that area, but it's not quite as mature on the operations side for cybersecurity. Plus, it changes frequently. So, you've got these integrated systems, you've got PLCs, you've got different things. But tomorrow you'll have some different technology, blockchain, or I threw it out there.
AI-powered blockchain.
AI-powered blockchain.
In the cloud.
In the cloud.
SCADA.
But one thing I'll say is, and Andy, I'm kind of surprised you didn't bring this up, but
I'm sorry.
Some of these systems, it's your fault. Some of these systems are insecure by design, as Dale Peterson says, which is in many cases, they optimize for safety rather than security. So you might find yourself in a situation where you're trying to secure something in a way that makes it unsafe. And if you look at some of these devices, I made a joke earlier, I'll bring up now because it seems opportune. A lot of times PLCs, some of the programmable logic controllers, they run without an operating system. An operating system is what controls and gates access to the physical hardware. So if you don't have an operating system, you're essentially running straight from the controller's memory. So when you plug those into a network, any network information that gets to them is going straight into memory somewhere and then being directly executed. That's fairly insecure by design. Mm-hmm. And the joke I made earlier is it's like the teleprompter for Ron Burgundy in Anchorman. anything you give him on a teleprompter, he'll read aloud. Anything you give these PLCs, they'll just execute. So at the sensor and the controller level, there's really almost no products available that would meet any kind of a security standard or certification.
Well, maybe the initiative Siemens and the others are spearheading from the product side. We'll start to see a change in that. I don't mean to misrepresent what Dale Peterson says. He's brilliant.
Yeah.
But he would have us question the idea or the efficacy of hunting down vulnerabilities known and discovering new ones in these systems when it's comparatively so simple to just gain some credentials that are publicly available and start driving them the way you want to. You don't even need vulnerabilities when it's so easy to commandeer them right now. And I think you could argue, you could debate the merits of both sides of that a little bit. To the certification comment, I'll plug Underwriter Laboratory. There's the people that make to make the standards comments more tangible. You have an electric product or an appliance, it has to conform to certain standards. If it doesn't, you can't sell it in the United States. And if it didn't conform because you bought it on the black market, you could electrocute yourself, burn your house down, right? So we have, this isn't a religious thing, but we have faith that if it's UL certified, we can plug it in and feel okay about it, right? The Underwriters Laboratory gentleman named Ken Modesta is spearheading an ICS security initiative to see if UL type practices can be brought to this space. Again, back to debates, you could definitely argue that standards and certifications are false hope, that merely complying to that talented adversaries, well-resourced adversaries, will be able to skate around those pretty easily. Nevertheless, there is value in good hygiene to keep the ankle biters at bay, the non-targeted attacks. So, like I said, you could open that up for debate, but people are pursuing it like UL.
We've probably got time for one more question before we do final. All right, we got 2 questions here, and then that'll be it. So go to that one first, and then we'll take the one on the other side of the room.
Yes, I was wondering about open source software in this space. If anyone could speak to that a little bit. I don't know if that's something that is seen as potentially useful in this area or as a solution.
So open source software is actually in a lot of what currently exists. It's kind of like the code components end up popping up in various different places. And with open source software, you already have some of the transparency mechanisms that we're talking about until it hits a commercial product, in which case sometimes they don't disclose what's in there. Or if they do, the lawyers know what's in there, but the engineers don't always, right? So lawyers have to track it for licensing compliance, but they're not tracking vulnerabilities in it. So I think open source has some definite benefits going into industrial control systems. It also has some drawbacks. So when it's a community-maintained initiative, the community might decide no longer to support something and to just stop working on it, right? There's no commercial contract which requires that they keep going and keep improving or keep it secure. That's hopefully the role of the supplier who imports the open source, but sometimes they don't do a great job of tracking it, or they're not keeping up with it, or when a project gets abandoned, they continue to use the older version. I think there's a lot of hope and promise in open source, even in industrial control systems. And I think that organizations can take advantage of a lot of that. Some of them run open source, like Linux on their HMIs and other places as well. Open source thoughts?
I have no extra illumination on that topic.
Okay, thank you. Last question.
So, Andy, you mentioned that in this attack in the Ukraine that had happened, they still had people who were trained to use these old systems. They hadn't switched over to the more efficient, more profitable new system. If you think of critical infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and cascading failure, are efficiency and resiliency opposed? Like, are they? Is it possible to have both without effective regulation? Because I was interested to hear the panel say that the role of regulation might be different, and if companies start regulating themselves, how do you see that playing out?
So it's a wonderful, rich topic to explore. I published a paper a couple weeks ago with Harvard Business Review. At one point, it had a section, and I think some of the content's still in there, called "Efficiency Fights Security," and that the non-considered drive towards just getting as efficient as possible for bottom line benefits, for competitive benefits, when that's done without thinking of the security ramifications of what you're doing and the extra risk that you're taking on, which I do think is the case in most sectors. We have to make it so that people understand that it's a trade-off. You can have extra efficiency, often gained through automation, right? But you're taking on things and that you're probably not aware of. I think the more pointed version of your question is, can you have both? And I think so. You could have both if you were considering if you were fully informed. In Idaho National Lab, we will call this cyber-informed engineering, or the even longer compound acronym, consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering. Consequence-driven, isn't that wonderful? Meaning you're making these decisions about what to deploy, how to gain advantages from a business perspective, fully informed by the extra risks, including supply chain risks, that you're taking on by adopting these systems. And it's a really good idea if you want to have efficiency and security/safety in the ICS world, to make sure that you have a plan B, so that as you're not just completely betting the farm on the automated system. In the case of the Ukrainians who accidentally, just based on the timing of the attack, hadn't switched over all the way yet, they were able to have a taste of efficiency and the reality of still some security, because they had the operators and engineers still on hand to do it. They had a plan B. It might have been an unwitting plan B, but they had it. Fortunately, we got to see that, and what I think Wired magazine, Andrew Greenberg, and others call the pogrom, the testing ground that Russia uses Ukraine as a testing ground for its new attacks, is also a classroom for us and for everybody. So in theory, we can learn some of those lessons and have plan Bs, less digital fallback systems that we can turn to if we got to that point.
That's the key. Sorry.
I would just add one thing to Andy's response. You talk about cascading systems, and from a risk management perspective, today we look at risk we look at the fault. Where can we find the faults that led to the consequence? Was it a failure of a part? Was it a mistake that somebody made? So we have an approach, thinking to narrow down and get right at that one thing, to change out that system, hold that person accountable. So maybe the next stage of this research, or research down the road, would be to look at resilience and look at systems of systems. You write articles, I read books. There's an interesting book called Drift into Failure that talks about using the science of complexity, because these are systems of systems. So how can we look at lots of data to be able to do predictive analysis and say, all right, we can see failure about to happen, whether it's introduced through a supply chain or some other cyber means. So I think that sort of is a thought for open research.
Okay. I would just add that all companies are driving towards efficiency, but to really get there, you have to think through what could happen in advance. We've had companies come in and want to reduce the number of bodies because of the new technology. And then an incident occurs and nobody is there to respond. Nobody actually sees it happening. And the solution is to think about, okay, if nobody's there, can you put cameras there? You have to think the next step beyond. So I think you can have efficiency and security, but you really have to think it through hard.
As long as you don't have self-modifying code.
Right.
All right, so we will give you some final thoughts. Jesper, I don't know if you want to go.
Yeah, just very quickly, excellent question and fantastic discussion, and all due to Andy and Bo. You were really stellar paper. I think it's great, and I mean, for me, I think what I take from here is really this balanced approach of, let's not only try and catch, the most recent crisis and what we could do about that, but take a step back, talking about detection, not only for other systems, but your own. I mean, if you don't know that you have a problem, or maybe you are the problem, that's problematic. So let's, think through all of these steps, and I think the event today is part of that process. So, great.
Joyce?
So I hope that, I thought the paper was very good. I appreciate the opportunity to join you here, and I actually would look forward to following up with you on some of the recommendations across the government.
Yeah, great.
We said this at the beginning, this is a super ponderous, thorny problem. Part of the reason for choosing it, as Bo said, is because it's so hard. I'm terrible at quotes, but I'm from Boston, JFK. When you come to the airport at Logan, you can hear a recording of him. It says, and I'm not going to do the accent, we choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And I think that for anybody in the room or otherwise accessing this information, if you like it in part because it's tough, but really important and worth, I don't know if it's going to be solved, but it certainly can be substantially improved, then sink your teeth into it and go for it. We need all the energy we can get.
I would just say Andy and Bo did a fantastic job with the paper, very thought-provoking, and a subject that I was not necessarily that knowledgeable about, but learned a lot. But I think from a regulatory perspective and moving forward, we really need to continue to share information. And I think that's the most important point I would make.
Yeah, well, I'll say that mine is not the final word. It's the opening of a conversation that we'll have offline over the next days, weeks, months, probably years, as we can hopefully create bite-sized chunks out of the elephant of a problem and move forward to be safer sooner together. So thank you all for coming out, watching it online, and we will see you later.